one that was thrown out this morning in the paper, the one.
Possibly.
Andrew Finn.
Andrew Finn?
It's live.
Oh, okay, we're live. We're live.
Infrastructure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's no.
Yeah, Andy.
Right.
Good morning.
Good morning. Councillors, on a cold morning. Our topic for this first session is to look at the mission that has been compiled in response to the recent proposal through the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment of Central Government. Their proposal to make it easier to build 60 square metre secondary dwellings on properties as part of housing provisioning, which is important for the new government. So through the CE, councillors had raised concerns about let's compile a submission to reflect upon how it may impact upon our business and TA duties. So we've duly compiled that submission. Nick Eagle, Sarah from Building and myself, and with some comments and feed-in through Janice in terms of coverage of topics. So what you see before you is that draft, and good morning to councillors online, Alistair and Melissa, and we have Nick from planning, and we have Andy from infrastructure online as well. So I'll just take you through it simply. So it's workshop situation, and questions can be posed and further elaboration points explored as in terms of looking at the draft. So in compiling it, we've looked at how the potential proliferation of your dwellings, 60 square metres of 60 square metre size appearing on residential properties would impact upon us as a council. One of the key things we've looked at is sought input from Wellington Water, and they've duly compiled points of note for the submission. And in terms of, we've also looked at building surety and new approach compared to what's normally expected through the building process. So we've looked at the building aspect, and we've looked at planning in terms of planning, controlling what goes for land uses and going on land, and in respect of hazards and peculiarities of particular sites. So in terms of coverage, we've looked at infrastructure impact, noting obviously that we've got a constrained situation in terms of two plants for our 3 towns at the moment. So when we look down for the impact of 3 waters, Wellington Water has noted that the concerns around supply and connection implications in terms of water, stormwater and flood hazard implications as well, and also wastewater with capacity issues at the wastewater treatment plants, as I mentioned. And you see those points listed in bullet points there. Give you just some time to look at those, and you may have some questions, but mentioning connections to private networks on existing properties may result in low pressure, for example. Separate connections are made to the public main and as appropriate with a metered connection. So Wellington Water have had a good look. They've helped inform us and for the needs of the submission, and it's all the practical impact in a realm of constraint, and you know what could be the concern points in the proliferation of several units across the towns. In terms of stormwater, application assessment must be performed by council and Wellington Water to ensure that the property is not built in flood-prone areas. And that's, for example, that bullet point's a connection point between infrastructure and planning. You know, not siting new buildings in the wrong areas. Second bullet point under stormwater does not cause obstruction to overland flow paths resulting in diversion and elevated flooding levels for existing properties. Habitable floor levels is another mention point from Wellington Water. The topic of hydraulic neutrality is always important in terms of stormwater management. It's a modern practice and expectation that there's stormwater neutrality on sites, and someone's stormwater doesn't cause concern or problem to a neighbouring site, for example. Then as we look down to through wastewater, bullet points in terms of potential impact, property is appropriately serviced for wastewater. There are currently capacity issues in the South Wairarapa district relating to wastewater treatment plants. Second bullet point tells the current story to government on this matter. The private wastewater network meets building standards requirements to avoid inflow and infiltration issues. Gully traps are set above and away from frequently flood prone areas. And then in terms of building consent, we need to clearly state as a functioning TA the value and security that's provided through building consent process. Building consent authority, we have a BCA functioning, and that's all about public safety and long-term surety of buildings. BCA ensures compliance with legislation and building codes. So we'd really need to defend and keep that at the forefront. So that's why that's in the submission. It's not clear, another bullet point just over the page, it's not clear whether council will hold any liability as a result of the PIM or notification process. Liability exists for councils, and if we know about a build that may have problems, therefore council's input and resulting liability needs to be clearly outlined. So we're signalling that council doesn't want to be the problem solver further down the track, coupled with the fact that we do good TA work anyway. The bullet point below that goes on to say that outcomes and principles do not have sufficient focus on quality assurance, liability and long-term asset outcomes. And Sarah's helped note that in the next bullet point, removing councils fully from the regulatory process needs to work for all parties, which includes councils, homeowners, lenders, insurers, licensed building practitioners, LPBs, and homeowners are entitled to assurances that the removal of regulatory oversight will not disadvantage them, their property in the long term. Subsequent bullet point you can see there, by removing the BCA from the process, short-term measures to reduce costs and delays can result in long-term costs to future owners, e.g. the history of leaky buildings. Licensed professionals, we've noted that there are concerns about the proposals for LPPs, licensed building practitioners and plumbers and drainers to self-certify their work. Council should review their building applications and on-site work, and frequently there is incorrect or missing information. So this all lands in the basket of risk management. Also, there are significant numbers of failed building inspections from LPPs where the building work is deficient. Then the subsequent bullet point about LPPs, plumbers, gas fitters and drainers need to be, schemes need to be strengthened. And then we move down to the planning component. Planning officer are experts in planning and policy. They navigate the district's unique features and understand protection and values within the district. They also understand areas subject to hazards and areas that are unsuitable to build upon due to such things as contamination or toxic hazards. Through this, council ensures long-term sustainability of the district and the sustainability of individual properties. The next topic is setting public expectations on land use. Exempting granny flats from the district plan rules raises questions about the purpose of environmental planning. If granny flats do not need to comply with the district plan, why should other buildings have to comply? policy could be seen as the policy undermines the district plan. So you'll see that a theme of our submission points is elevating the topic on risk and surety and functionality and duties of the council. Another point there is that is a finding from Sarah's area in terms of garages. Currently, garages or sheds are built under the exemption schedule. However, building inspectors find them repurposed as dwellings without consent, leading to issues with safety, amenity and planning compliance. So those are threefold issues. Rating charges. Janice was good in her guidance in terms of making the link or including capture of rating, our current rating policy in terms of the submission, proliferation of small 60 square metre homes. They will be captured as a separately used or inhabitable part in terms of rating. So we've signalled back to FB that although you intend the provision of small homes on sites, e.g. a small home but besides the main home, they will be captured in terms of our rating impact. And just in terms of the detail below there, that's come direct from finance and indicates the cost impact. So we're just signalling on that. And then we get down to the recommendations, stating clearly in the first part, SWDC does not support the proposal and has the following recommendations. The first recommendations is that MB considers the following easier option to increase supply of secondary simple 60 square metre dwellings, but with fewer risks. That means give further consideration to option 4 of the Building Act options listed in Appendix 1 of the discussion document, which involves the use of existing schemes and reduces the consenting time frame, i.e. that's through multi-proof or built-ready schemes. And point B, supporting that first recommendation, is using this option would shorten the consenting timeframes, reduce costs and use the existing BCA consenting process, resulting in lower risk to current and future owners. Second point, in terms of principles, clarity that there are two separate pathways for building a secondary 60 square metre dwelling. The LPB scheduled granny flat pathway, which clearly states councils, BCAs will not be undertaking any regulatory process nor be liable for any building or planning works carried out under the scheme, and the existing council BCA pathway. Point B, housing safety, strengthening the licensing building practitioner scheme. And second point, point 2, ensure that there are mechanisms for LPBs, licensed building practitioners, to identify hazards as listed in the next point, district plan zones and overlays. Point 3, granny flats schedules to be set out clearly in one document in a format accessible on the level of a new LPB graduate, and that it contain wraparound instructions for every aspect, including assessment of protected sites, hazardous land, underground services, etc. And then we move to point C under the second recommendation, quality outcomes for building construction and for its 50+ year lifespan, and D, clear policy explanations on the reasons a 60 square metre dwelling is exempt from district plan rules. And then 3, that granny flat policy explicitly states that PIM or plan notification process are for council records only. No building or planning regulatory functions are required of council, and they are not liable for any building or resource consent non-compliance. issues. B, that PIM and PAN or similar notification process be compulsory to ensure rates are appropriately adjusted and charged for additional units. Point C, it is clearly stated that whether garages are in or out of the Granny Flat scheme, just because of that point, garage spaces are repurposed for sleeping and habitation, and additional buildings increase the demand on infrastructure. And point D, last 3 points, D, for example, if garages are included, the risks of repurposing and increased infrastructure usage need to be clearly mitigated. E, the national planning instrument, be the NPSUD, which is about all urban development, with an amendment for simple 60 square metre secondary dwellings. And last point, if the NPSUD, the product of government that is, and NPS HPL are aligned and coherent on simple 60 square metre secondary dwellings. With a concluding capture remark for our council, allowing buildings to be constructed without building or resource consent and owners being responsible for ensuring qualified professionals carry out the work is likely to result in an increase in complaints and potential complaints for landowners, as outlined above. This could also result in an increased demand for monitoring and enforcement, which is not currently resourced within the planning and regulatory space. And we all know how busy we are as a small functioning council. So hopefully that hasn't been too much of a ash over the head in terms of a summary, but welcome any questions and points of clarification. And we have Nick Eagle online, and we've got Sarah and myself.
I have a great deal of sympathy for Minister Bishop's proposal. I think it broadly is a very sensible sort of cutting the Gordian knot to getting more buildings built quickly. I think your points around are we clear who bears the risks from this are absolutely well made. But I think if the legislation made it absolutely clear that the building owner or the property owner who was causing the building to burn was 100% liable, then I'm not sure after that I especially care from a council point of view. Obviously, when they come to sell their house, they'll find that there is no information for that. That will probably reduce the value that they are willing to offer for a building, or at least they will require somebody to go and get a proper building inspection at that point. But as long as our involvement in that can be fully charged for, then from sitting at a council, I'm reasonably neutral about that. The aspects that I think are likely to be of most concern / interest here is does everybody who thinks they can put 60 square metres on their land think they can also have a water and a wastewater connection? Question mark. And I assume even at the moment, even if this legislation went ahead in its raw form, they still cannot connect to wastewater unless we say so. Is that right or wrong?
Connection to wastewater relies on the updated advice from Wellington Water, our experts, and so once we get resolution on issues, we will be notified from them that connections are okay.
Yeah, but I'm assuming that
Any flex though.
I'm assuming that there might be occasions where, for a variety of reasons, it doesn't. Wellington Water we are the regulator here for all intents and purposes. If we said we can't stop you building a 60 square metre from a building, but you will not be able to connect to the wastewater system, are we able to do that?
So they have to apply for a permit if they want to do a septic.
That's what I thought. That's what,
So the risk would be that they'll just connect into the existing already on the property.
right.
So we don't have any control over that.
Is a plumber able to do that just off their own bat?
If
We didn't miss it.
allowed to happen.
Yeah.
Unless it was specifically stated that they had to have a separate connection as part of being allowed to build it.
Right. So in other words, putting in a granny flat, just call them granny flats, and connecting to an existing wastewater outlet would be no different than if they put in a second bathroom in an existing house and used existing. Right.
I think the only difference with that is if they did that, they'd require consent. If you, through the additions and alterations in the Act, you would require a consent to be.
If you're adding a bathroom, yes.
Bathroom
Right.
interfacing with
Yeah.
those in your property, you would require a consent, but under this, they wouldn't.
Yes, that certainly those aspects, in my view, should be aligned. And I suspect that we won't be the only council that has concerns about more connections to wastewater, more connections to drinking water. And that strikes me as being the biggest knock-on effect to us and to other residents.
And I just, in the document that I read, it said that there was the option for the work to be notified to councils. So in that case, that would be quite a different setup, wouldn't it? Notification of work to councils, and it says proposes an option of requirement to notified councils of the planned work with plans and requesting information, etc. So that would be similar to a building consent.
So that's the permit process I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So no, because we're not looking at, we're not checking for compliance.
okay, so that,
It's basically just.
so that means we
providing-
don't have to go back out and actually check how it's done.
No, we
That's just saying, can we connect and can we do this?
Yeah. Yeah, to a certain extent. So
Yeah.
what it's asking is
Yeah.
what can we do on our property, basically. This is what we're proposing to do.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, okay.
And then council would just say yes or no, and then that's the end of their,
That.
because this is,
Yeah, to make sure that we don't have any liability as a result of that.
so with what's currently there, that's not what it says, or? So it's saying that council would still be needing to do the additional work, or
It's not all that clear.
clear? Okay, yeah.
We understood what you're trying to talk. Long time.
Yeah, thank you. I've got a bit of sympathy with Martin's comments, and certainly I don't particularly care if somebody builds a house that's buyer beware and it's at your own risk a little bit, 60 square metres. So in terms of the regulatory side, Russell, that you're talking about there, I think the government's trying to get around some of that. The issue that Martin raises, I think, is really important in terms of how do we maintain the money coming into, and it's not about the connections, it's about actually the money coming in so that we can manage the connections and manage the throughput. And our SUIP rating system will capture that anyway, because that's why we've gone to it. So that if you put a granny flat at the back, you're going to get charged extra rates anyway. And I'm not quite sure how the link to a planning consent and the SUIP, because we're doing that on the we're identifying our SUIPs through a different mechanism. So I'm not so sure that we need to worry too much about that. And I've got to ask the question, say, putting a granny flat in with one toilet and one shower, which is generally what they would have, is that any different than anyone who lives in town putting in an extra bathroom in their house now, which whilst they get consent, I can't imagine that we would ever say, no, you can't put an extra shower in your existing house that is already connected to a system. So sort of, I think we're perhaps making a bit of a mountain out of a molehill here a little bit, I think.
Can I respond to that?
Please do.
It is a given that we would pick this up under the SUP legislation that we're bringing through into the rates, because at the moment QV rely on building consent notifications for new builds, adds and alts. So if we don't have that, there's no trigger for QV to know that there's a second dwelling or provision on the property. Council staff are generally not warranted staff, so we can't go onto the property to look for them. You know, if they're behind fences or trees and things and we can't see them, we could potentially never know that they exist from a rating perspective if the legislation goes through as it is, because there's no change of use, there's no notification through planning or building that anything has happened on that land. And I'm sorry, I'm going to have to disagree with you that this isn't a mountain out of a molehill when it comes to potential onflow effects of stormwater onto the properties, flow paths, and if there was a proliferation of these, then yes, the extra bathroom and extra toilet would have an impact on our systems.
Oh, sorry, you're good. Oh, okay. I just got some concern about the potential buildings going in the floodplain areas. We've got concerns about that already, and this is going to open up a whole other problem if a whole lot of places can be built in floodplain areas that we could potentially have some moral, if not legal, liability for in terms of floods.
Actually goes towards someone.
Yeah.
That actually goes towards some of my questions as well.
Yeah.
It comes down to the legalities of council moving forward once it's built, because although people say, you know, they don't, we're not going to have any oversight on the build and everything like that, when there becomes a problem,
Yes.
and we are still rating for that property, whether or not we're as with the SORT or without the SORT, when we are rating for it and taking money from those people who own the property, their expectation is that council needs to help.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, the whole premise of this is around how do we limit council's risk in this situation? You all know what happened with the leaky building legislation and where that went. And council finds itself as last man standing in that position because very often the people who built it are no longer in business. You know, the cost to rectify those, because we had an input into the building consent process, falls to council. So that's why this is written, to say we need to be really clear that council has no legal liability whatsoever if this legislation goes through, that it remains with the owner and the practitioner, because at the moment that's not clear. And we do not want to find ourselves
That's what I'm reading.
being the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff when bad decisions come home.
That's my big concern.
And I mean, I totally, to me, it's the legality later on, liability.
Or even expectation.
That and the point that Janice has made, I think answers your point, councillor, in terms of locational risk, building surety, and any other court action, and the potential of combined group court action that ends up on council's desk because parties have moved on, or it's 10 years down the track.
That's right, they're sold.
Lisa?
So I was just sort of going back to the, how does council mitigate the risk of not only wastewater connections, because I'd argue that if you're building a separate dwelling, it probably means you have an increase in the number of people living on your property as well, but equally stormwater as well. So is there anything in the legislation that makes it clear that those that are building a secondary dwelling, a granny flat, need to capture or deal with their rainwater, stormwater runoff? So I'm thinking the garage part of the consent process for that was either having a soak pit or rainwater collection suitable for the size of the building. Does that sit alongside the building of a granny flat, or do we run into an issue where we've got, you know, potentially people in our urban areas building these granny flats and no provision for rainwater runoff as well.
Yeah, so that's, that all comes down to the building has to comply with the building code. And the management of the stormwater from the roof of the building is required to be contained to avoid nuisance to other properties.
But you're not signing
And
that.
council still has the ability to check those aspects, given that we're not.
No, if we're
going
not
through all of that
consenting,
consenting.
yeah, if we're not consenting it, we're not inspecting it.
Mhm.
So this
Yeah,
is where it all,
so it can say you need to have it, but there's nothing actually making sure that you do in fact have those things in place. Thank you.
Another. Just another. Happy.
Yeah, the rest shoved to us. Yeah, that's right.
The other risk too is that there's the potential that at some point in the future we have a change of government and then a future change of legislation again reverting back, and we can end up with these, I guess, trapped assets in the community that were built when we didn't have oversight, but now we do have oversight of those, and liability for future owners. So if something's built and then the legislation changes and then this house has to be sold, who's now responsible for making sure that that building does have consent down the track? Yeah.
That's very much a it's a good point, because we have to do our best to look into the future as to what eventualities might arise, and that is one such situation.
It also means that anyone who's got one now that they've already done, which we know has happened, and garages converted and things, could just potentially say, I built it in this time period, and we won't be able to prove or disprove that either, would we? So
I think they would have to prove it.
quite tricky.
Yeah. I don't believe there's a case in the last 50 years, an example in the last 50 years where the government has retrospective and added liability to anybody. There have been cases where it's retrospectively taken a liability that was discovered off people or organisations. It just wouldn't pass the Bill of Rights.
The true matter on that would be the matter of case law on different topics. So as to you'd have to explore case law to get your full definition of the extent of the issue.
Yeah, but I think Councillor Gray's example was if a legislated change comes, just highly.
Well, hang on. No. Let's just take this one more step then, because after the flooding that happened, we saw that suddenly council became needing to pay, for a lot of the costs for the insurance. Instead, of getting the help that in the past, there was more help that was coming from central government. So that's just one. So these things do change. So you're saying you don't believe that there's been anything, but when we're looking at a picture from local government versus central government versus what comes down to being changed and then how it's being interpreted, I think that's a perfect case to show the difference where councils like Masterton District Council have found themselves.
They didn't have to. Many councils in the same position didn't do what needed.
Oh, I think it's one thing between legally and in fact the social pressure and expectation, and what do we do if there's people homeless and constantly savings? There is a council moral responsibility as well for a safety net.
Okay.
I think the one that, or the sentence that makes me most concerned, it's something about causing obstruction to overland flow paths. And I think, I was talking to somebody last week who, in his property at the edge of Featherston a while ago, his neighbour who owns a plot of land decided to bury a cow or something. There was like a natural depression and a cow died, so he put it in there and then buried it. not really thinking too much more of it, but that changed the overland flow path of water. So whereas water would normally travel along that little path and join the bigger stream, it now diverts back and ends up in his property. So I think even, I mean, that's just burying a cow, but if you're putting a building somewhere and you're not aware of the movement of water or where it necessarily needs to go, we might not have liability over that building, but what about the people further down that we have consented properties
Live there.
flood path? Does that increase our liability down there, or yeah?
Well, it comes back to that, the example you've given, councillor, is the taps into that modern topic of stormwater neutrality and containment. So you don't want issues to be issues bigger than they should be. So as part of the submission, we've tried to signal that as one of the matters, and that's through with the help of Wellington Water.
Deadline for this submission is Monday.
Oh, God.
There are a few changes that I think need to be made to this, particularly in the rating space. I don't want those numbers and things going in there. And some of the acronyms, we need to make sure that we're clear on what the acronyms all mean. So they mean what we know what they mean, but we need to be clear. But generally, I'm really pleased with how this has come together. This is going in for South Wairarapa District Council, so it's I need to know whether you're comfortable with this going in this format or not. It is probably one of the biggest changes that could impact on us as a council that they're proposing to make. The other things around the RMA are kind of, they're changing policy statements and things, but this and the ability to increase the footprint on the property, especially from a stormwater perspective, knowing we have stormwater issues, is probably one of the biggest risks we've got.
I wonder, Janice, if in the section on the recommendations, that isn't potentially some midway point. I mean, I was conscious of a couple of the comments that Sarah made. And it seems to me that the midway point is, yeah, you can go ahead and do it without a building consent. You do have to provide a little more proof that actually it has met the Building Act. I think the thing with the garages at the moment is do it without consent, but you don't actually have to prove you've complied with the Building Act. I think that is true, but and it seems to me here that the things such as have you actually taken proper provision for stormwater off the roof? Well, when the drain layer's building the soak pit, they can take a photograph of that. Is there adequate insulation on the walls? The building can take a photograph of that, for example, which is possibly not much different nowadays from what one of your staff might be doing at an inspection. But I think what the government's concerned about here is getting these things to happen just takes so long. And
I would counter that to say it takes the time it takes because we're acting as we're working with the homeowner to make sure that they get a good product at the end of it. And we accept that we have a role to play in that. But if we start asking for photographs of soak pits and insulation, then we are putting ourselves in a position of future liability if we're accepting that information into our records.
well, again,
That's why
I fully endorse I fully endorse the point that we must argue that it is quite clear there is no liability in this process that ever comes back to council. I mean, I think that's the main responsibility we have to try and argue for. But I mean, for example, there was an article not in the Post, whether it was accurate or not, I don't know, but actually getting permission to start your build in Hutt City was taking something like 9 months. I think that's the thing that government as well. Thank you.
Melissa?
Thank you. I'm happy to support the submission, and I'm happy to support it based on the fact that it is a submission. It's unlikely that all of the recommendations or the recommendations in whole will be accepted by central government. But I think the important point of a submission from a council or from anyone is that we represent the situation in our own area. And to my mind, the kind of special characteristics or the special specifics that we need to be thinking about here are wastewater connection, given the issues that we have with our treatment plants, and stormwater. And so whilst I appreciate that the government, central government, are trying to address issues of speed and of housing provision, and that's fine, and that's, you know, good for them, we have to be mindful of what is or will not work for our district and our communities. And how this will have a flow-on effect for our community. So I'm quite happy to support it based on that. Thank you.
I'd like to say that for myself, like, I mean, this is a great report, but even I get a little bit confused because someone's saying I think we need to be really clear about council will not, you know, as being asked to take responsibility for this. It will not sit here. You know, do you know what I mean? Like, it's a little bit. There's a lot of information, and to be fair, we've only just received it. So I don't know. There's just a lot of words, and there's a lot of things, and that some are kind of like, but if this happens, then this would be a great way to do this. But then it's like, and like you said, Sarah, they haven't really given. It hasn't been made clear. So I think we need to say, this is the clarity, like this is what we want it to say. So when it comes to our water supply, when it comes through to our stormwater, and the fact that exactly we don't want to have this go through and then we're going to have this the same issue with wastewater a lot faster than what we have in the past. So I don't know if I'm making heaps of sense but I'm just on the brief overview.
Well,
That's
yeah,
kind of my feeling.
I was wondering, I mean, I know it's the wrong words for local government, almost like an executive summary of the point we'd really like to make sure, you know, don't happen, like, you know, increased liability to us, increased risk to us, increased cost to us. Let's build those out in a sort of almost a summary of what we really, really want to be changed. I don't know, because I think that's right, we have to read
Clarity.
So I
Yeah,
hear your
yeah.
comments. They're well said, those comments, but I would just draw your attention to closing remarks.
Mm.
Yeah.
Is our capture point. That's the basis of our position. Unless councillors want to either soften it or strengthen it or see some sort of reshaping.
Perhaps just a little bit more specific. It's a little bit high level. So,
I mean, it is a submission on legislation, so it should be high level. Like, this is not for going out to the general public. This is not a
no,
communication to the community. This is
yeah,
a submission against legislation. So
just for them to really get our real clear points of expansion or definition to safeguard us.
I think you raised a good point. I think Melissa's raised a really good point as well, and it's more about just that clarification around what, you know, that these things must have that mitigation in there by whoever's doing the work if council no longer is, because that's actually also taking away a revenue stream for council.
yeah, I mean, I don't think it's so much the revenue stream, although it's nice to have revenue streams. I think, like, when I read through it, it's very clear. It's saying SWDC does not support the following aspects of the proposal, and then the reasons, you know, the flow-on effects from that, and then there's a whole part about our liability, and then, yeah, I think at the end, you know, it's got clear recommendations, and then the concluding remarks. bring it all together, I think it's quite a good submission. I'd be really happy to support this. Yeah.
I think the concluding remarks could be strengthened. And I've actually written something down here about council needing surety there'll be no future liability issues arising from this legislation, as they currently, councils currently find themselves as last man standing, as they did with leaky buildings. So that there is something there that we need to be clear about. The risk and the liability issues are primary. The stormwater issue for me is significant, I think. I mean, I know Andy's on the call, and you know, in his previous role, he's come across numerous ones of these where somebody has bought a property that's now got a flow path that's diverted itself back to its original position. All sorts of stormwater issues that have come from this kind of ad hoc building in the past.
Unintended consequences.
You want to make, Andy, about some of the things that you've come across in your engineering lifespan?
I think in answer to that, I think the points that have been discussed around the table are valid. The stormwater issue is a problematic child and has been across many councils for many years, particularly around overland flow paths. We've got a workshop shortly around stormwater, and some of the issues that you've highlighted today in this meeting are front of mind in the discussions going forward. There has to be an increase, or there will be an increased focus on stormwater as part of ongoing local waters done well. And I think the issue around granny flats and the opportunity to alter overland flow paths for residents to expect council to step in and deal with issues downstream will increase as part of this legislation.
Thanks, Andy, for that. We've got Alistair and we've got Aidan, who didn't get his opportunity.
Can we hear
Thank
from
you.
Aidan? Alistair, can we hear from Aidan first, because he hasn't
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Thanks.
Just listening to everybody and going through this, I think, you know, the government's intention, you know, their intention is to solve some problems about housing and affordable housing and housing, bringing diversity into communities. I think if we didn't have the infrastructure issues we've currently got at the moment, I think their proposal, their legislation would be great. If all our infrastructure issues around water, wastewater and stormwater were solved, I'd be keen to support the legislation. However, we're not in that position. So certainly, yeah, I'm keen with the submission, you know, reading through the submission has pointed out the issues and the factors which we find ourselves in. Going forward, that was all I needed to say. Thanks, Russell.
Thank you for that. Alistair?
Yeah, thank you. Listening to what everyone says, to me, when you start a paper off and says we do not support, it's a negative paper. And listening to what everybody said here, we have obviously, and Aidan's just highlighted there, we have issues around our three water issues, and they seem to be the dominating factor here. So to me, what we want to be doing in this paper is actually seeking clarification of where the liabilities sit and what would be the rules around connecting to that, rather than actually going, and we don't support this for ABC, because if there's one thing we've learned from this government is this legislation is going to go through, and you've got to accept that it's going to go through, because you've just got to look at what's happened in the last 6 months or so. So therefore, you write a paper that says, how do we gain clarity, and how do we make sure that in the legislation are the issues that raise and protect us from liability and connections and so on. How do we enforce that? If you go in with a negative, we don't support, human nature, people will look at it and go, okay, thanks very much, that's great. But if you go in with solutions, or offering, saying, you know, this is where we stand, this is what we would need to make this work, as a tone, changes the tone of the paper. Get your same points across, but you just change the tone of the paper. That's all I'd say.
Can I respond to that view? In terms of submission work, whether whatever realm it is in, the expectation is that you either support or not support, i.e. oppose the current proposal. So it is normal wording in terms of response wording for a private person or whoever to state their angle in respect to a proposal currently put forward.
And my point to that would be, how's that worked out in the past?
If you fail to state your position, you don't achieve your clarity. That's your clarity.
I think you missed my point. I said I'm not talking about stating our position. I'm talking about how do you actually accept that this is going through, and how do you write something that is actually then finding solutions rather than just negatives.
We were trying to make quite clear what the points were we wanted changed, and I didn't thought we were saying that we were opposed to it. I thought we were just saying there was some risk to it that we need to look at and some clarification. I didn't. Do we say anywhere that we're?
Yes,
It's up for a general position.
Oh, I guess.
What just says the following?
and I would support Alice's contention that it's much more likely to be positively read if it's positively framed.
Whatever, I think that's the main thing, is we want to have clarification about what the point of the risk we see to us that we want to clarify.
I totally agree with that, Kay. It's just how do you word it so it's positive rather than negative.
Yeah. I thought it was more like neutral. This is what we need changed.
It's feedback, winning feedback.
So in terms of the general position, we could change that to SWDC has serious concerns in relation to the following aspects of the proposal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the same at the end.
What about we support the intent of legislation, however, because of the our infrastructure issues which we are currently facing. That will limit or create risk towards.
Not just the infrastructure though.
Okay.
That's a big part of it for sure. But when we talk about things like overland flow paths, that's not an infrastructure thing. That is, people can put buildings wherever they like without really having any sort of oversight. That's going to have potential
Water flows.
Yeah.
liability that lands on the council for
Floodplains, yeah. It's bigger than 3 waters.
Opening storm, for instance.
So what are the solutions then? You know, what are the suggestions to mitigate some of those things rather than just these are the issues? Going in with solutions always works better.
Well, we've got solutions at the end. That's in the recommendations. I think some of the wording could be changed slightly to make it clearer, but we do have recommendations at the end. So let me just backtrack. If it now says SWDC supports the intent of the legislation in terms of housing provision, but has serious concerns in relation to the following aspects of the proposal. Does that sit better with how you want the general position to be put? So we're in support of the fact that we need it for housing, but we've got serious concerns about these issues. And then we go through the issue.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then
And that was the stormwater probably
clarity
needs.
in the recommendations to make it clear what we're saying.
Definitely concerned about.
And then we'll just strengthen up the concluding remarks and make them hang off that general position.
The floodplains part will probably
Yeah.
need to.
I'd like to add, I think it was a very good, very good paper.
I think
Thanks, Russell.
content is here. We just need to massage it a bit before we send it in.
Yes.
Yep, no, we can do that. And Alistair, I do note your point in terms of
interface and being effective with government in terms of phrasing. So thank you for those comments.
Right. Any final comments? We move to the next topic.
The team from Wellington Water are just out there coming in.
You would excuse me for 30 minutes?
Do we want to take a quick break, get a coffee? We're going to be talking to the.
Yeah.